In the 3rd year of King Belshazzar's reign, I, Daniel, had a vision, after the one that had already appeared to me. In my vision I saw myself in the citadel of Susa, in the province of Elam. In the vision I was beside the Ulai Canal. I looked up, and there before me was a ram with 2 horns, standing beside the canal, and the horns were long. One of the horns was longer than the other, but grew up later. I watched the ram as he charged toward the west and the north and the south. No animal could stand against him, and none could rescue from his power. He did as he pleased, and became great. As I was thinking about this, suddenly a goat with a prominent horn between his eyes came from the west, crossing the whole earth without touching the ground. He came toward the 2-horned ram I had seen standing beside the canal, and charged at him in great rage. I saw him attack the ram furiously, striking the ram and shattering his 2 horns. The ram was powerless to stand against him. The goat knocked him to the ground and trampled on him, and none could rescue the ram from his power. The goat became very great, but at the height of his power, his large horn was broken off, and in its place 4 prominent horns grew up toward the 4 winds of heaven. Out of one of them came another horn, which started small, but grew in power to the south and to the east and toward the beautiful land. It grew until it reached the host of the heavens, and it threw some of the starry host down to the earth and trampled on them. It set itself up to be as great as the prince of the host. It took away the daily sacrifice from him, and the place of his sanctuary was brought low. Because of rebellion, the host of the saints and the daily sacrifice were given over to it. It prospered in everything it did, and truth was thrown to the ground. Then I heard a holy one speaking, and another holy one said to him, "How long will it take for the vision to be fulfilled? The vision concerning the daily sacrifice, the rebellion that causes desolation, and the surrender of the sanctuary and of the host that will be trampled underfoot." He said to me, "It will take 2,300 evenings and mornings. Then the sanctuary will be reconsecrated." While I, Daniel, was watching the vision and trying to understand it, there before me stood one who looked like a man. And I heard a man's voice from the Ulai calling, "Gabriel, tell this man the meaning of the vision." As he came near the place where I was standing, I was terrified and fell prostrate. "Son of man," he said to me, "understand that the vision concerns the time of the end." While he was speaking to me, I was in a deep sleep with my face to the ground. Then he touched me and raised me to my feet. He said, "I am going to tell you what will happen later in the time of wrath, because the vision concerns the appointed time of the end. The 2-horned ram that you saw represents the kings of Media and Persia. The shaggy goat is the king of Greece, and the large horn between his eyes is the first king. The 4 horns that replaced the one that was broken off represent 4 kingdoms that will emerge from his nation, but will not have the same power. In the latter part of their reign, when rebels have become completely wicked, a stern-faced king, a master of intrigue, will arise. He will become very strong, but not by his own power. He will cause astounding devastation, and will succeed in whatever he does. He will destroy the mighty men and the holy people. He will cause deceit to prosper, and he will consider himself superior. When they feel secure, he will destroy many, and take his stand against the Prince of Princes. Yet he will be destroyed, but not by human power. The vision of the evenings and mornings that has been given you is true. but seal up the vision, for it concerns the distant future. I, Daniel, was exhausted and lay ill for several days. Then I got up and went about the king's business. I was appalled by the vision. It was beyond understanding. Well, we're back in Daniel chapter 8 tonight. You'll hopefully remember that we began looking at this chapter last week, and we saw that in Daniel chapter 8, Daniel sees a vision. And in this vision, God shows Daniel some of the most momentous and most important events that are going to take place over the next several hundred years. And something that we saw last week, something really, really striking about this passage, is how incredibly detailed each of these prophecies are. God really does put his reputation on the line by giving us these promises. If they were to be proven false, well, then we couldn't believe a word that God tells us. And just think of some of the predictions that we looked at last week. We saw, for example, the Persian Empire is going to become the most powerful empire in the world. We saw that the various Greek states, which hated each other's guts, they would unite into one country, and they would take on the Persians, and they would absolutely blow the Persians away. And maybe most of all, we saw that there was going to be one great Greek king, and he would be about as majestic, about as brilliant, as tactically superb as you can possibly get. He would conquer vast swathes of territory. But we also saw, when he was at the peak of his powers, he would be cut down, but not by human power. And last week we had a whistle-stop tour of the history books. We thought especially about Alexander the Great. He is the prominent horn on the shaggy goat in Daniel's vision. And we left off at verse 8 in the vision, which is also verse 21 in the interpretation. Alexander was master of the most incredible empire that the world had ever seen, but suddenly and dramatically, he died of a mystery fever when he was just 32 years old. Well, tonight we want to see what happened next, and as we do that, we also want to see a number of practical lessons for you and for me today. So let's look back at Daniel chapter 8. Now, we have seen already this vision comes in 3 different parts. In part 1, we have this ram, and the ram is the Persian Empire. It savages the nations around it, it gobbles them up. In part 2, we have this shaggy goat, and this goat is the empire of Alexander the Great, and it blows the Persians completely out of the water. But I want you to notice what happens next. Notice verse 8. The goat, and that's Greece, became very great, but at the height of his power, his large horn, that's Alexander the Great, was broken off, and in its place 4 prominent horns grew up toward the 4 winds of heaven. So in the year 323 BC, Alexander dies really suddenly, and this one horn is replaced by 4 horns. And this is then explained for us later in the passage, verse 22. The 4 horns that replaced the one that was broken off represent 4 kingdoms that will emerge from his nation, but will not have the same power. Now, God gave Daniel this vision more than 200 years before any of this happened. And here's how it happened. Here is what the history books say. Alexander died suddenly. We saw that last week. And there was a power struggle. And his kingdom was carved up among some of his most powerful generals. Now, there are all sorts of developments we don't have time to get into this evening, but eventually things settled down, and really you had 4 main kingdoms, just as Daniel chapter 8 says. And 2 of those kingdoms are especially important for the rest of Daniel. And so I'm going to show you a map. First of all, one of Alexander's generals, a man called Ptolemy, set up his kingdom in Egypt. And then the other really important general was a man called Seleucus, and he set up his kingdom in Babylon, or what today would be Iraq. And so these two kingdoms are the Ptolemaic kingdom and the Seleucid kingdom. And the Seleucid kingdom becomes really, really significant. It wins a whole host of battles, it takes a whole lot of land, and eventually it conquers an enormous chunk of the Middle East. And one of the places that the Seleucid Empire eventually came to control was Israel. Israel was, or Judah, I suppose, the southern kingdom. It was really a vassal state, it was a puppet state. But the Seleucid kingdom called the shots. And that is something that we actually see in verse 9. This kingdom, this horn, started small, but grew in power to the south and to the east and towards the beautiful land. Now, I want you to also notice verse 23. What we see next is in the latter part of the reign of these four horns. So it's not actually Seleucid himself, or Seleucus, that we see in this vision. It's one of the men, years and years later, who ruled over the Seleucid kingdom. And the man that I want to tell you about this evening is a man called Antiochus the Fourth. And Antiochus gave himself a nickname. And that nickname was, I was going to put it up on the screen for you, but that nickname was Antiochus Epiphanes. And Antiochus Epiphanes, really what it means is, Epiphanes, God manifest. So he was a very, very boastful man. Antiochus Epiphanes. Having said that, a lot of other people gave him a slightly different nickname. He called himself Antiochus Epiphanes. They called him Antiochus Epimanes. And that means Madman. And that's where the title of our sermon tonight comes from. And I think both of those names, the name he chose and the name people gave him, they really get to the heart of this man. He was incredibly conceited. He was incredibly vain, incredibly ambitious, but also incredibly sadistic. He was unpredictable. He was a man you didn't know what he was going to do next, and he was certainly a man you didn't want to cross. Notice, for example, how he's described in verse 23. He is a stern-faced king, a master of intrigue. And even though Antiochus Epiphanes was not a man you wanted to cross, well, that's exactly what the Jewish people did. They thought they had a golden opportunity to get their independence back, but they didn't really. And it was a botched job, and it didn't work out. And Antiochus Epiphanes was absolutely furious. And he resolved that he was going to make the Jews pay. And let me read for you a quote from a historian from around about that time. Now, the numbers, I suspect, are really very inflated, but you'll hopefully get the general point of what happened. This historian says this: raging like a wild animal, he set out from Egypt. He'd been fighting a war in Egypt, and he took Jerusalem by storm. He ordered his soldiers to cut down without mercy those whom they met, and to slay those who took refuge in their houses. There was a massacre of old and young, a killing of women and children, a slaughter of virgins and infants. In the space of 3 days, 80,000 were lost, 40,000 meeting a violent death, and the same number being sold into slavery. Now, the numbers may be inflated, but we're certainly talking about thousands and thousands of people murdered and thousands of people taken away to be slaves. It is absolutely vicious. And yet, we shouldn't be surprised, because is this not exactly what God says is going to happen? Verse 10. It grew until it reached the host of the heavens, this little horn, and it threw some of the starry host down to the earth and trampled on them. Or as we see in verse 24, he will cause astounding devastation and will succeed in whatever he does. He will destroy the mighty men and the holy people. A terrible, vicious man. But he doesn't stop there. You see, Antiochus, he hated the Jews so much, he wanted to destroy not just the people, but the very Jewishness of the population. And so he started this campaign of persecution. It was a barbaric campaign, but more than that, it was specifically designed to wipe out everything that made God's people special. So, for example, he marched into the temple and he converted it into a temple of Zeus. He made just about the most calculated insult that you could possibly imagine. He took a pig, and of course pigs to Jewish people are an absolute monstrosity, and he had that pig sacrificed on God's altar. Not only that, but once a month he would send his men and they would force the Jews to make unclean sacrifices, to sacrifice unclean animals. And if they said no, they were put to death. You can see how verse 11 describes that. It set itself up to be as great as the prince of the host. It took away the daily sacrifice from him, and the place of his sanctuary was brought low. This man really, really hated God's people. Another thing he did was circumcision, obviously, was the great covenant sign. It was the great mark of being one of God's people. So Antiochus made circumcision illegal. In fact, if a baby was found to have been circumcised, there are several examples of those babies being taken to the top of the city walls and thrown off. And the mothers would be killed in really horrific ways as well. Antiochus made it illegal to keep the Sabbath day. In fact, there was one Sabbath where a group of people were gathering in a cave to worship in secret, and they were caught and they were burnt. If you were caught with a copy of the Old Testament, you could be killed. As simple as that. We could spend from now until midnight reading some of the stories that have been passed down. Believe me, there are many more stories that I haven't shared. I have deliberately left out some of the most gruesome ones because I know that some of the kids are watching. But we could cover all of those stories. We could spend hours looking at this, and we still wouldn't grasp how incredibly agonizing this must have been. It is an appalling, an agonizing period in Israel's history. Is it any wonder that after the vision is finished, after it's been explained, Daniel says in verse 27, I was appalled by the vision. Well, of course he's appalled, because this is not a pleasant part of the Bible. Well, why are we looking at it? Well, we're looking at it because it's God's word. We're looking at it because God has clearly decided this is something useful for us to understand. But we're also looking at it because there is good news in this passage. And I want us to take two big lessons away from this passage. And the two lessons are this. The first lesson is that King Jesus is still on the throne. King Jesus is still on the throne. Now, I realise that is easy for me to say, sitting here in my comfortable house. Much more of a challenge if you were a Christian in Saudi Arabia and you'd been locked up for your faith. But it's still true. Even the fiercest persecution that you can possibly imagine doesn't change the fact that God is in control. And I think there is something in this passage that is really helpful for us to recognize. It's verse 26. God says, "Seal up the vision, for it concerns the distant future." Well, why do you seal something up? You seal it up so you can open it again whenever the time is right. Maybe if you want to imagine this chapter like this, those red boxes that you get. You'll get it, for example, on a train or on a bus sometimes. Red box has a glass panel. Inside there might be, say, a hatchet, and it says, "In case of emergency, break glass." Well, that, in a sense, is what Daniel chapter 8 is like. It's not that it isn't useful for Daniel. I think it was very useful for Daniel, and we'll see that maybe in a few weeks' time. But it's really especially useful for God's people who lived almost 400 years after Daniel, the people who actually had to live through this persecution by Antiochus Epiphanes. Every single day they would have faced the fiercest of temptation to just give up. It would have been absolutely off the charts. And you can try and imagine it, but you won't want to imagine it. Imagine having to choose between sticking to your faith and your children's lives. Imagine having friends or family members who refused to sacrifice and were strangled. And then imagine having a book or knowing of a book, and this book was written almost 400 years before, and it accurately predicts everything that has happened that has brought you to this point. Surely you would break the glass and you would take those words to heart. Surely you would cling to what those words say, because it would remind you, if God has made all of these predictions and God has got them all right to this point, well, surely then God is in control, even over this. And I think there's a lesson in that for us. Now, obviously, we want to be reading our Bible every day. It's not just for emergencies. But sometimes we do pass through times of trial, don't we? And thankfully, those times of trial, they're not anywhere near as violent, at least, as what we see in this chapter. But they shake us to our core, don't they? And at times like that, it's almost like we need to smash the emergency glass and we need to pull out God's word. We need to find those passages that speak about God's sovereignty and God's wisdom and his purpose. And then we need to cling to those passages for all that we've got. And I wonder, maybe some of you watching tonight, maybe that's you. Maybe you need to take those passages and you need to hold them close. And if it's not you, well, it will be. Someday it will be. And let me say to you, the more that you are taking those passages to heart now, the easier it's going to be to anchor yourself to those passages in the future. We need to grasp that God is in control. And there's an even more explicit help in this passage. A help for those who are going through persecution. You see that not only does God predict how all of this is going to start, but he also predicts how it's going to end. I want you to notice verse 13. Then I heard a holy one speaking, and another holy one said to him, "How long will it take for the vision to be fulfilled? The vision concerning the daily sacrifice, the rebellion that causes desolation, and the surrender of the sanctuary and of the host that will be trampled underfoot." He said to me, "It will take 2,300 evenings and mornings. Then the sanctuary will be reconsecrated." You might also want to note verse 25. Speaking of Antiochus Epiphanes, he will be destroyed, but not by human power. Okay, so verse 14, 2,300 evenings and mornings. Big question is, what does that mean? Well, that's actually quite a difficult question to answer. If you take 2,300 evenings and mornings to be 2,300 days, well then that is, roughly speaking, 6 years. It's a little bit more, but 6 years fits in, by and large, with the total length of this persecution by Antiochus Epiphanes. But if you take an evening and a morning to be two separate things, the evening and the morning sacrifices, and we are looking at this in the context of the temple, well then it's a little bit over 3 years, because it's 1,150 days. And that fits in with the period when the sacrifices were abolished. So, which one is it? Well, I'm not going to come down one way or another, but what I will say is this: whichever one it is, God has set a limit. And that surely should be a comforting truth. God has set a limit to the length of this persecution. What I'm about to say is going to sound incredibly trivial and trite by comparison, but I wonder how many of you watching have had a test for COVID this year. I've had one, and to be perfectly honest, it's not especially pleasant. It's not sore, but it's definitely not comfortable to have a swab stuck deep up your nose. And I don't know if all of the nurses doing the testing do this, but the nurse who did my test, she did this. She put the swab up my nose and she counted down. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. And something so simple, and yet it was really helpful, because you knew that in spite of how uncomfortable this is, you're very quickly getting to the end. Well, surely we have something similar, but to a far greater degree in this chapter. These people are going through vicious persecution, but they know that this persecution is not indefinite. It is not open-ended. And if, by the grace of God, they can reach the end of the 2,300 evenings and mornings, it's done. It's over. It's not going to continue anymore. Or to put it another way, Antiochus Epiphanes, this madman, this vicious, snarling dog of a man, he's on a leash. It's a long leash, but it's still a leash. And he can only go as far as God allows, and he can only persecute for as long as God allows. And then, when he reaches the end of the leash, he's done. Because God is in control. And let me say, the same is true of every single trial that you face. Your sickness, your unemployment, your temptation. God may not tell you how long it's going to last, but that doesn't change the fact that God is completely in control. And if God decides that 81 hairs on your head are going to be harmed by some trial, you can be absolutely certain that hair number 82 on your head is going to be perfectly safe. Because King Jesus is on the throne, and no amount of persecution and no amount of trial is going to change that. I think there's application as well whenever it comes to world events. I've said this before during our Daniel series, Maybe going to sound like a stuck record, but I am absolutely amazed whenever I see Christians getting all flustered by the stuff that's going on in the world. You go onto Twitter and you see some people and they are absolutely despairing about what Joe Biden is going to do whenever he becomes president. And they're despairing over what the Democrats are going to do and how they're going to bring down society. Well, you know what? If God can keep Antiochus Epiphanes on a leash, well then God can manage Joe Biden. And he can manage anybody else. There is no king, there is no president, there is no leader of any kind whatsoever who can go even one single step further than Jesus Christ allows. Because King Jesus is on the throne. That's the first lesson that we learn from this part of the chapter. The second lesson is that King Jesus' people are who really matter. King Jesus' people are who really matter. Now, there are 3 parts to this vision, remember. There's the Persian Empire, there's Alexander the Great, and there's Antiochus Epiphanes. And the Persian Empire is really, really illustrious. We still talk about aspects of the Persian Empire today. We still talk about marathons, for example, and the marathon is named after the Battle of Marathon between the Persians and the Athenians. Some of you, younger ones maybe, will know the film 300. It's all about the Battle of Thermopylae between the Persians and the Spartans. So the Persian Empire is incredibly illustrious, but it's nothing compared to Alexander's empire. Alexander took it to a whole new level. Some of you will maybe know the city of Alexandria in Egypt. It's named after Alexander. But what you might not know is there are at least 50 different cities that were called after Alexander. Even in this last week, someone who was watching the service last Sunday evening told me about a song written in the 1980s all about Alexander. You go onto Amazon, you search for Alexander the Great, and you will find pages and pages of books and movies all celebrating this one man. And then there's Antiochus Epiphanes. Had you heard of him before tonight? Maybe not. He's hardly remembered nowadays. In fact, the story that Antiochus is most remembered for, and we might look at this another week, I think we maybe will when we reach chapter 11, the story he's most famous for in history is an occasion where he gets absolutely humiliated. He gets humiliated by a doddery old man who holds a stick. But here's the thing. You add up all of the verses in the dream and all of the verses in the interpretation. We've got 4 verses about Persia. We've got 5 verses about Alexander. We've got 10 verses about Antiochus. And not only that, but Antiochus is also a main character in the rest of the book. And I think that's something that should surprise us. Dale Ralph Davis, he's a man who writes commentaries on some books of the Bible. He's very helpful. But he says this: is it really necessary to spill all this ink on someone who is really a minor character on the roster of history? And that's a good question, isn't it? In fact, Dale Ralph Davis, he calls the chapter in his book, when he writes about Daniel chapter 8, why is a 2-bit king so important? And that's exactly what Antiochus is. He's a 2-bit king compared to Alexander and Darius and Cyrus and the great kings of the Persian Empire. But the answer is, Antiochus is so important because he dared to challenge God's rule. And more than that, he dared to persecute God's people. And I think this chapter and the rest of Daniel, it shows us that what really matters to God is not the vast empires that shape the history of the world. It's not the kings who shape the entire culture of Western civilization. It's not the great generals who have whole shelves in the library dedicated to their abilities. No. It's you. And it's me. It's his covenant people. It is the people he has saved, he has chosen for himself, and the people whom he works through. And I think that is both an encouragement and a challenge. It's an encouragement because sometimes we think our lives don't matter. Our wee lives, not that important in the grand scheme of things. Well, surely the sheer amount of ink that Daniel spends on Antiochus in this chapter, that should dispel that notion, shouldn't it? Of course God cares. You should never think that God is too busy with the White House or with the Kremlin or with the UN to care about you and your family, or you and your exams, or you and your friendships, because God really, really cares about his people. If we can put it like this: if you are a Christian, Donald Trump, Vladimir Putin, they're not at the centre of God's universe. You are. This is an encouragement, surely, as we think about the church. We're small, aren't we? All this talk about lockdowns and restrictions, but there's not a TV station in this country that I'm aware of that gives two hoots what the church has to say about that. They're far more interested in businesses. But God has a deep and a passionate interest in the welfare of his people. This passage is a real comfort. If you are a subject of King Jesus, then you really matter. You have value. As well as being a comfort, this passage is surely a challenge. The challenge is this: if this is what God says really matters, what do you say? Or more to the point, what does your day-to-day routine say matters? You know, if somehow we were able to follow you around for a day, and if we were to tally up how long you spend talking about various different topics, or how long you spend doing certain things, or if we could maybe read your mind and see how long you think about certain things, what would we conclude is the most important thing in the world? Would it be sport, or fashion, or Instagram, or TikTok, or a boyfriend or a girlfriend, your mortgage, your promotion, your exams? Would it be politics? Would it be COVID or lockdowns? What is most important when we look at the balance of your life? Surely there's a challenge here. God says that what really matters is not any of those things, but it's the welfare of his covenant people. It's the church. It's the people of Jesus Christ. And I wonder, maybe for some of you, this chapter is a wake-up call. Maybe for some of you, you've got the balance completely and utterly wrong. Maybe some of you have allowed serving in the church to fall to second place in your life, or third place, or fourth, or fifth, or sixth place. Surely every single one of us wants to focus our attention not on what the world says is important, but on what God, the creator of the universe, what Jesus Christ, the King of the universe, says is important. King Jesus is on the throne, and the people of King Jesus really matter. And so the two great challenges from this chapter: as you face hardship, will you cling to the fact that Jesus is in control? And as you go about your day-to-day life, will you give yourself to the welfare of the people of Jesus Christ? Let's pray.